Hey there, Meteorologist John Burchfield here. Thanks for tuning into the Climate Friday newsletter. If you're not already subscribed, you can head to WTOL.com/email and we'll send the latest climate-related information straight to your inbox each and every week. Now, winter is well upon us, and the big subject lately has been Lake Erie and Great Lakes ice cover. We had that Arctic blast last week. Temperatures plummeted down below zero, and we saw the response of ice developing not only on Lake Erie and the Great Lakes, but on the Maumee River right here in the 419. So in this week's Climate Friday, we're going to talk about Lake Erie ice cover and the Great Lakes as a whole, and really the first ice fishing season that we have had in several seasons with the cold temperatures setting in. Now, with the ice on the lake does come some dangers that we want to give you a heads up about, and we've been talking this week on WTOL 11 News about ice floes and shifts and cracks in the ice that can develop in response to changes in the weather. So in this week's edition, we're going to be breaking down some of the weather impacts that can cause those ice flows, and also what you need to know if you're hoping to take advantage of that ice for ice fishing this season. So let's start things off by talking about our Lake Erie ice cover. That black line shows Lake Erie ice cover this year, and the red line shows ice cover in a typical year. Now, needless to say, the ice season was off to a bit of a slow start in December. We did have that rapid spike that occurred in January, and that was in response to the Arctic blast that occurred just last week. That increase in ice resulted in ice cover covering about 85% of Lake Erie. Now, of course, it didn't really stay at that level due to some warming temperatures. Levels dropped and then rose again, and then dropped and then rose again. And as of this recording, we are at about 75% ice cover. Regardless, that is well above average in the ice department compared to what Lake Erie normally experiences at this point in the winter. Again, the red line shows you our normal ice cover throughout the winter season. And as you can see, through November and December, not a whole lot of ice typically on the lake, but then by January into February, we are normally at around 45% of ice. Typically, our ice cover peaks in late February into early March, resulting in about 60% of the lake covered in ice. So to see 75, even pushing 80% of the lake covered in ice, that is anomalous and unusual, and that is why ice fishers have really been trying to take advantage of this weather pattern. Here's a graphic showing you Lake Erie ice cover and the different categories of ice based on how much of it is frozen over, and you can see ice cover as a whole is at approximately 75% as of late Thursday into Friday. Now, what about the Great Lakes in their entirety? The Great Lakes saw the greatest or highest amount of ice cover since February of 2022. That was a winter that is certainly memorable for ice fishers, where the Great Lakes were over 50% covered in ice at that point in the season. Now, as I mentioned, ice cover typically peaks during the month of February, so we're not totally there just yet, but we are starting to inch toward the latter stages of winter. Great Lakes ice cover as of late Thursday is at 19%. We were at around 25% last week after that Arctic blast, but ice cover has subsequently dropped slightly in response to warming temperatures in Lake Erie. Here at home, about 75% covered in ice. This map of ice cover really shows you just how shallow Lake Erie is and how rapidly it freezes over in comparison to the other Great Lakes. That white color indicates where there is ice that is present on the Great Lakes based on the latest observational trends. As you can see, the vast majority of Lake Erie is covered in ice. In some of the other Great Lakes, it's really just dependent upon where is the most shallow. Oftentimes, the depth of the lake dictates ice cover more so than the actual air temperatures, as the deeper the water, the warmer it is and the more heat it retains. Lake Erie ice cover by far the most of any of the Great Lakes. Looking out towards Lake Ontario, amounts have held steady right at around 11%. Lake Huron, though, has seen a decline in that ice. Lake Huron's ice levels after last week's Arctic blast were at about 31%, and it's dropped down to 21%. Lake Michigan has also dropped. Lake Michigan was in the 20s, now at about 15, and Lake Superior at about 7% due to the depth. Even though you're at a further northern latitude with colder temperatures, not really a ton of Lake Superior is frozen over. So let's talk about the weather conditions that play a role in the safety of the ice and what you need to know if you are planning on heading out for ice fishing or winter recreation out on around the Great Lakes. Ice flow danger typically results when you have windy and warm winter days. Now, earlier on this week and over the weekend, we saw southwesterly winds gusting to about 40 miles per hour. Even though Lake Erie is largely covered in ice, that ice is not necessarily safe and sound, especially when you have the wind that can cause fractures in the ice and ice flows. Now, a whole host of different weather patterns and weather phenomena can impact the ice, but I would say temperatures, wind, sunshine, and snow are the primary factors. Now, temperatures often result in what we call a freeze-thaw cycle. In other words, we get a really cold snap that causes rapid freezing, but then that ice can melt when we do see warmer temperatures. And that's what we've experienced this week. Even though Lake Erie was about 85% covered in ice just about a week ago, those amounts have declined to 75% due to the thawing cycle that has ensued. Winds also play a significant role, and southwest winds are particularly dangerous for ice fishers when we do see that wind direction that is more susceptible to breaking apart chunks of ice. So southwest winds, be wary, especially when those gusts are exceeding 30 miles an hour. Sunshine can also contribute to melting ice, and we have seen some brighter skies this week, and that has caused a bit of melting on the Great Lakes, and also snow. Last but not least, when you have that layer of ice that develops, snow falls on top of it. Now, it can help trap in some of the colder air, but it also puts weight and pressure on the ice, and due to that snow depth, that can also help fracture and break apart chunks of ice. So what do you need to know as far as ice fishing safety is concerned? We always have more updated information on WTOL.com if there is going to be any impactful weather that does affect ice fishing. Generally speaking, if that ice is less than 2 inches, you need to absolutely keep off. That is dangerous ice, even for pedestrians, even to walk on foot, not safe whatsoever. Ice fishing is generally safe when you get to about 4-inch ice depth. Now, that doesn't mean you can drive the ATV out there, but at least walking on foot is a bit more safe. And be sure to check that the ice around you is safe and sound, as there can be some variation on Lake Erie based on the depth of the water and the thickness of the ice. Snowmobiles and ATVs, once you get up to closer to half a foot thick ice, that is when that becomes safe. And cars and small trucks, of course, that requires a much sturdier foundation, and at bare minimum 8 inches of ice required for cars and small trucks. Medium-sized trucks, once the ice gets really thick later on in the winter during a particularly cold year like we saw in 2022, that requires at least a foot, if not 15 inches of ice for medium-sized trucks. So what are we forecasting as far as the lake conditions are concerned? Well, needless to say, temperatures have been warming up, and your forecast for Friday is expected to stay milder as well. The breeze is also going to be picking up. Friday morning, not so bad as far as the winds are concerned, but then Friday evening, as the cold front moves through, we're actually going to be seeing winds blowing from the north. Now, that will actually help cool temperatures off for Saturday, but ahead of the cold front, we're going to be seeing warm temperatures Friday as well as rain chances. So rain on the icy lake could potentially complicate matters and could contribute to some melting. So we'll keep a very close eye on lake conditions, but I would be wary of the freeze-thaw cycle and the rise in temperatures that could be impacting the security of that lake ice. Now, should we get another cold snap or Arctic blast, that would enable some refreezing and potentially rising those ice levels back up into the ballpark of 80 to 85% ice. Subscribe to that Climate Friday newsletter, and this week we broke down Lake Erie ice and Great Lakes ice cover and the conditions that contribute to ice flows and ice fishing safety, and we'll have more coming straight to your inbox next week. We'll see you then.